We'll start without a presentation. Thank you, Emily, for good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to the conference. Emily in Israel. I'm going to jump into a debate that started 2 weeks ago in the U.S., in Washington, by Fareed Zakaria, who published a very interesting op-ed at the Times and later went to his GPS show on CNN and went on saying basically that the Saudi Arabia nuclear option is a bluff. Contrary to Fareed Zakaria, I think not. One of the consequences of a negotiation with Iran has been increased tensions between U.S. and some of its allies in the Middle East. Most dramatically, Saudi Arabia has signaled in the last 4 or 5 years its displeasure by threatening to go nuclear. King Salman of Saudi Arabia will probably not speak in front of the U.S. Congress, as Netanyahu did. But he is not less concerned than Israel about the emerging terms of an upcoming deal. I want to argue here in my 20 minutes that an agreement that will leave Iran a threshold state or a screw turn away from being a nuclear arms state will prompt Saudi Arabia to match, in the long term, to match Iran's threshold capability. While a deal with Iran is unlikely to immediately launch a full military nuclear program in Saudi Arabia for various reasons, it may cause the kingdom to spend the next decade building up nuclear infrastructure and making other preparation in order to keep future options open. Hedging. Why a decade? Because the Saudis believe that the agreement with Iran will give them more or less 10 years in which, in the immediate future, Saudi Arabia wouldn't have to violate its non-proliferation commitments if it chooses to pursue the nuclear path. Well, beside the nitty-gritty of the potential agreement, the kingdom and some of its GCC allies fear most the potential for U.S.-Iranian rapprochement and the implication of the agreement on Iran's status in the region, far more than they fear the agreement's technical significance. The result, many in the Gulf prefer no deal, although no one will say it publicly. I had a really good PowerPoint for this, but thus, the Saudis might challenge any U.S.-Iranian diplomatic breakthrough, fearing that the U.S. might make concessions to Iran or alternatively reward it for making concessions by giving Tehran a free hand in the region. Saudi Arabia, therefore, wishes to keep pace with Iran and is determined to accelerate its investigation into the nuclear field, a move that certainly undermined U.S. non-proliferation efforts. Saudi Arabia announced in 2011 its very ambitious plan to build no less than 16 nuclear power plants at the estimated cost of more than $100 billion. Moreover, some of the most senior Saudi princes have, in recent years, stated that the military nuclear might is something the kingdom is obligated to examine if Tehran is granted the right to enrich uranium. I've always said, whatever comes out of these talks, we will want the same. Prince Turki al-Faisal a month ago. In other words, Saudi Arabia wants whatever Iran gets. Well, Saudi Arabia is not the only country in the GCC to pursue a nuclear program. The UAE is building up its own program and has agreed not to conduct any fuel cycle activities within its territory. The existence of such a clause, in addition to Abu Dhabi's commitment to transparency and compliance with IAEA regulations, has caused the U.S. to dub this agreement as the gold standard for similar possible agreements in the future. Well, can the UAE serve as a model for the Saudis? In contrast to the UAE, Saudi is unlikely to accept Iran's de facto right to enrich, while they have to compromise their own right. Nuclear energy is attractive to Saudi Arabia for several reasons. First, desalination. More than 70% of Saudi Arabia's drinking water comes from desalinated seawater, and using nuclear energy for fueling desalinations is less expensive than using oil in the long run. Second is energy demand. The repercussions of failing to develop alternative sources of energy are serious. The kingdom now consumes 1/4 of its total oil production. This means that as in business as usual trajectory, in 2038, Saudi Arabia will become a net oil importer. Just a few days ago, some of the rhetoric in the last few years, I quoted one. This is the Barka site near the Saudi border in the UAE. Last week, the first one is almost concluded, 4 in total. The vessel for the second reactor was constructed last week. They are before the deadline, both on time and money in the UAE. Along with this potential civilian benefits for the Saudi, a Saudi nuclear program also serves as a response to Iran nuclear development, particularly as a means of increasing pressure on the U.S. to deal more forcibly with Iran on the terms of the nuclear agreements. Saudi Arabia has exerted such pressure through signals that it will not relinquish its right to enrich uranium as the UAE did, as long as that any agreement with Iran would grant the latter just that. It would, however, the Saudis, consider other options to have a third country supply enriched uranium to both Iran and Saudi Arabia, or to get Iran to agree to join a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. At present, Saudi Arabia suffers from substantial technical limitation. This makes the development of even a civilian nuclear program difficult and requires agreements with third parties. They don't have the technological infrastructure yet, but they have pressing security threat and national or leadership will to go nuclear, and of course the financial means to do that. In fact, Saudi Arabia's growing nuclear appetite makes it probably the biggest potential market for nuclear-related exports worldwide. These are only some of the companies that are making business or trying to make business, already signs MOUs and other agreements with the kingdom. What all that means? It means that we might see an increased appetite in Saudi Arabia, but not just in Saudi Arabia, in some of the region's capital for achieving a threshold status. While civilian nuclear development in Saudi Arabia may be a response to Iran nuclear development intended to exert pressure on the U.S. or provide economic benefits, the possibility that it could serve as a cover in a preliminary stage for a military program cannot be ruled out. Well, what can be done? The U.S. might be able to contain Saudi opposition to the deal with Iran by employing both reassurances and cohesion. U.S. President Barack Obama noted that he was aware of U.S. allies' concern and justified doubts. However, these comments, along with U.S. diplomatic activities and significant arms sales intended to reassure American Arab allies, did not alter concerns that the agreement with Iran is based on Iranian and Western self-deception. Well, if Saudi Arabia determines that the U.S. security umbrella is questionable, there is no guarantee that it will refrain from pursuing its own nuclear program. The fact is that if the Saudi leadership perceive that its essential security interests are threatened and its stability endangered, it may decide that prompt action is the best possible course to minimize risks and ensure the continuity of the House of Saud. A U.S. congressional report on this topic points out that the kingdom, and I quote, will not hesitate to aggressively bypass or risk alienating the U.S. in order to protect Saudi interests. Due to energy-related issues, matters of prestige and identity, and serious concerns regarding Iran, the attractiveness of a civilian nuclear program in the Gulf has continued, despite the Fukushima disaster of March 2011 that turned many nations away from nuclear energy altogether. Although past predictions concerning Middle East proliferations has proven incorrect so far, the conclusion of a final agreement with Iran, essentially giving Iran the right to enrich, means the possibility of Saudi Arabia heading down the same path cannot be overlooked. The U.S. will certainly exert significant pressure on Riyadh, and the provisions of the NPT will loom large. But the perception of the U.S. as an unreliable ally and the threat to Saudi survival may convince Saudi Arabia that it prefers to pursue its own method of deterrence. In the long term, either through a shift from a civilian to a nuclear weapons program, or in the short term by acquiring its own nuclear deterrent, or by forming an alliance with another existing nuclear power that could offer protection. What Fareed Zakaria opened the debate last week when he wrote that the Saudis cannot go nuclear because the only thing they know, and I quote, is to pump oil. Fareed, don't underestimate Saudi Arabia's nuclear options. The logic of Fareed Zakaria has led us in the past to underestimate other proliferation risks. In conclusion, Saudi Arabia is working to develop a fully functional civilian nuclear program. Its motivations stem for considering of prestige, energy concerns, and an answer, even symbolic, to Iran. Although Iran's nuclear pursuit is likely the primary impetus, it is not the only one. And any conclusion to the Iranian question is not likely to reverse such an endeavor in Saudi Arabia. In other words, the cat might be out of the bag, or the genie might be out of the bottle. Choose your own cliche for nascent, slow-motion Middle Eastern nuclear arms race. Thank you.